Tom Brooks is an Grammy-winning music producer, arranger, engineer, and keyboardist. He is the founding producer of Integrity Music and the Hosanna Music series, selling over 30 million albums worldwide. Tom has produced over 150 successful albums for Sony Music and has been awarded 6 platinum albums, 12 gold albums, plus a GMA Dove Award. He is keyboardist for the progressive rock band The Alan Parsons Project and music professor at Hope International University. His book, The Language of Music, is published by Hal Leonard Publishing. Tom has performed concerts and produced events around the globe, from Paris to Hong Kong, from Cape Town to Edinburgh, from Rome to Rio, and everywhere in between. Tom is owner and creative director of Master Recording Studios. He holds a doctorate in music and teaches workshops and seminars around the globe.
And we talked about how the personalities sort of take you on a journey as you go from this chord to that chord. Some chords feel like you're moving forward. Some chords feel like they're pulling you back home. Some chords will feel like a detour if you borrow a chord from a different chord family. But then you feel that sense of resolution when you finally get back to the one chord, the boss, the big kahuna, the home base. In the key of C major, it'd be the C. The other primary triad, the dominant, the 5, in the key of C, that's the G. That's the strongest pull in Western music. This chord is, I don't want to say 90%, maybe 80% of the time now. It's the chord that's going to draw you to home. It's the chord that goes right before home. So the dominant has a strong pull to the 1, the 5 to the 1. In fact, in just a second, we're going to talk about cadences. It's the strongest cadence in Western music for sure. Now, actually that relationship, the 5-1 relationship, if you think about it, here's the G. It pulls you upward by a 4th. That upward by a 4th movement is kind of like central to all chord progressions. That upward by a 4th movement is a really strong pull. When you feel music pulling you forward, a lot of times it's because of that upward by a 4th relationship, which, obviously you realize you can call it upward by a 4th. You're saying the same thing as downward by a 5th, right? You get that? Because if I'm here and I walk up 4, it's the same, I get to the same C as if I was here and I walk down a 5th, right? So upward by 4th, downward by 5th, same thing. Which, if you notice, we go back to that circle of 5ths, that's the relationship that the circle of 5ths is built on. So enough about that. So you got the primaries. Now I want to add one of the secondary chords, because seriously, you can add one of the secondary triads. I'm talking about the one that's built on 6, and you can play. Now we're up to probably 95% of the modern praise and worship songs we've got going. Now, so here's the 1, the 4, the 5, the 6. There's the 6. Now it's not one of the primary triads, but it's probably the secondary triad you hear most. It's funny to me, like when I think of these 4 chords, I can't help but think of like the very first song that every high school dance you go to, you can't not hear Heart and Soul. And surely somebody's going to find a piano in the house and play the duet, right? Well, what that is 1, 6, 4, 5, right? Right? 1, 6, 4, 5. Now, when I think of those 4 chords, the first worship song that pops into mind is, Chris Tomlin's "How Great." There's the 1 chord. Sing with me, how 6 is our God. Da 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 da. 4, 5, da da. 1. No, we wouldn't do it in that high a key. I'm just staying in C so that you can get the picture that 1, 6, 4, 5. Millions of songs use those progressions. Here's the added 2nd. Now, in pop music today, adding the second to the triad is so common. It's almost like adding salt to your French fries. You know what I mean? You get so used to it, and you hear it all the time. The interesting thing about this structure, leave out the third, is that it gives you a much starker, more modern feeling. For instance, we've been fed a steady diet of triads ever since, the 1600s. All of our music is built on triads. So when I'm doing a pop arrangement, anything I can do to get away from triads is a generally good thing. So this is a structure that you want to kind of keep an eye out for. Anytime you can voice a chord this way with seconds and fourths, or look what happens if you bring the root up an octave. Now you've just got a stack of fourths instead of a stack of thirds. Those kind of structures are definitely going to make your music sound a little bit more modern. So we're going to talk about voicing in a second, but when you get to voicing, just think that way. Try to keep an eye out for ways you can voice things in seconds and fourths rather than thirds. Now you think of Paul Balash's song "Open the Eyes of My Heart." This is a situation where a guitar player might just decide, well, you know what? I'm just going to leave those strings open. I'm not going to put any fingers on them, and I'm just going to let them ring through all the chords I'm going to play, and just see what added tones develop from that. So the first chord is E. Open the eyes. Obviously, those are both members of the E triad, so that's no big deal. And you go to the next chord, which is a B. Open the eyes of my heart. Well, the B's already in there, but the E is kind of a foreign animal to the B chord. It crashes against the third, but that crash is kind of a cool thing. You see what I'm saying? The same two open strings, let's go on to the next chord. I want to see you, an A chord. Well, the E's already in there, but now the B is that added second. It's that added second we just talked about. And these days, a lot of the sound you hear in these modern worship songs are a really rich palette of added tones that are coming from guitar players, sometimes just letting strings ring and just seeing what sounds develop. And if it sounds great, then make it part of the song. Another added tone is the added sixth. Now the sixth kind of got hooked into a cliche thing in the swing era in the 40s, but you do hear some uses of it in pop music. Let's go to our C triad. An added sixth is adding the A. Sounds like Anchors Away, right? Added six is not quite as common, but you do hear it. Sometimes you'll hear it walking, like if you have a thing where you're walking through the major seventh, you might walk through the sixth. Probably a more common added tone is adding the fourth. If you're adding a tone that gives you a whole step crash, it's not as biting, it's not as significant as adding one that gives you a half step crash. In fact, a pretty common thing to do is to go with A minor 7 and add the fourth like that, and you've got a pretty plush version of A minor. Think about How Great Is Our God. How great is our God, sing with me, how great. The way that's played on the record, that's exactly the chord that's there. It's an A minor 7 with an added fourth. So that sound is actually pretty familiar to you. Now, when you're adding a fourth to major, that's an entirely different thing. Let's look at that. Let's go to C major, and let's add a fourth. And you see what you've got? You've got that half step crash between 3 and 4. And you can hear where that's definitely more of a biting animal than adding it to the minor, right? Here it is adding it to major. Now, if you were in a college theory class, you would probably know that adding a fourth to a major triad, this would be like a major infraction. This would get you expelled from theory class in high school, because there's this whole issue of suspensions. You've heard of the 4-3 suspension. Maybe you've heard another musician talk about that. In classic theory, if you add a 4 to a major triad, you eliminate the third. So you either have to do this, which is the added fourth, or the regular triad with the third. But never in traditional theory could you have both. Now, you know, this is the 21st century and this is pop music, so you can pretty much, you know, write this off to one of those rules that needs to be broken. Now, when you start with the suspension and you resolve it, you really are following the basic traditional theory rules of a 4-3 suspension. But these days, you can break those rules. A lot of these added tones give you these like crashes and clashes that add, they kind of add angst to the music. You know, that crash can have an emotional pull. And thinking back to where we were a minute ago when we were on Open the Eyes of My Heart, remember that? And we went to the B chord. That's exactly what we had going there. We had the fourth crashing against the third. And normally, traditional theory, you would say, you're out, stay after class, write 10,000 times on the board, I will never have the fourth and the third at the same time. But when you listen to it in that song, it's got a bite, it's got a crash that in the course of the song is just kind of cool. It's what makes it sound modern. So in terms of the 21st century and modern theory, to have the third and the fourth at the same time is not that big a deal. To have the third and the fourth at the same time is not that big a deal. So we're on a G chord, and I've got the fourth and the third in there at the same time, and it's like it doesn't really bother you. It's just part of the added tones, part of the collage. That angst is kind of what makes it sound modern. It all crashes together, but it's not really a big issue. Kind of the general rule is this. If you're playing triads, you can experiment with any of these added tones. And the kind of concept is, if it sounds good, if it feels good, then you do it. Add it to the music. Now, the places you're going to find these, obviously C major 9. You know, this is sort of this is like a ballad, sort of a plush, you know, love song chord. Minor 9 chords are really common. Sing with me, how great. You could add the 9th to that. Major 9. Those are the most 9 chords you're going to run into. Now the other one that's built on 5, that's the dominant 9 chord. So in the key of C, when you build it on G, that's the place you're going to find the dominant 9 chord. At least that's where you're going to find it naturally. Now if you get into blues, like that 12-bar blues progression we talked about earlier, lots of times you can play a dominant 9 chord anywhere you want to. Like in a 12-bar blues, typically all 3 of those primary chords are going to be dominant 9 chords. You know, we talked before about the fact that you can play a million modern worship songs with just triads. You know, you're going to see some sevenths, you're going to see a little bit fewer ninths, you're going to see fewer 11ths, and rarely any 13ths. You know, if you play jazz or if you play gospel, you're definitely going to see more of these type of chords. But there is one 11th chord that's definitely worth talking about. And again, it's not the one that's built on the 1, on the tonic, it's the one that's built on the 5, the dominant 11th chord. So we're in the key of C, but I'm going to move down and I'm going to start building on a G note. So here's root 3rd, 5th of a G triad, 7th, 9th, 11th. Now, kind of use your brain for a second. You realize that the 11 up here is the same as the 4, right? Just an octave higher. It's a C against the E. Now remember a minute ago we were talking about suspensions? Well, when you have an 11th chord, a dominant 11th chord, in a sense what you've got is you've got that 4-3 suspension. I'm bringing this C down an octave. So what you've got is that G triad with a 4th and a 3rd at the same time, so you've got this crash there. Now we said, in some situations that crash is okay, it's that angst, that clash is a cool thing, but generally speaking, when you see a G11, it's like understood, it's an understood rule that you're going to leave out the third. It's kind of as though it's a sus and you're waiting for it to resolve. In fact, a lot of times you hear that. You'll hear G11 resolving to regular G. You know what I'm talking about? Like at the end of Shout to the Lord. Nothing compares with the da-da-da, G11, regular G resolving to the tonic. So just when you see G11 or any 11th chord, understand that the third is omitted to avoid that crash with the 11. Now another thing about this chord, a lot of times a shorthand is used. They'll write this as a slash chord because you notice, check this out, when you start building 11 chords, you've got a 6-note chord. There's your 3-note triad, 7, 9, 11. Now look what the 7, 9, 11 are. Let's pull these out for a second. The 7th and the 9th and the 11th are actually an F triad all by themselves. You see what I'm saying? Here's that root, there's the G triad, 7, 9, 11. It's an F triad all by itself. So a lot of times what people will do is they'll just write this chord as F over G. They'll write it as a slash chord. So basically these days, F over G is the same as G11, exactly the same chord. Now you can say, well, what about that D in there? Sometimes you might even see D minor 7 over G. It's the same thing. It's a G11 chord. But the main principle is you omit the third. And oftentimes you'll hear that 11 resolve to the third. I mean, that's a really typical authentic cadence. So that's by far the most common 11 chord that you're going to see. It's that dominant 11 chord. If you do any playing in gospel music or any jazz, that's where you're going to start to run into some of these upper tonality chords, they're called sometimes. We usually call them extended chords. Basically chords that extend beyond the octave. Another harmonic device I want you to know about is, I just refer to it as the bass to chord tone relationship. Basically, when we hear the lowest note, which would typically be in the bass guitar or the left hand of the piano, everything above that relates to that note. And there are certain things you can do. Take the song Mighty to Save, for instance. That starts off with this simple 3-note pattern. But the interesting thing is that what goes on below that changes, but that pattern never changes. But every time the bass note changes, it changes what these 3 notes mean. Make sense? So like right now, we just perceive that as being, 1, 2, 3 in the key of A. So you pretty much know you're going to expect a song in that key, right? But here's what happens. The first chord that comes in is not an A. The first chord that comes in is a D. So all of a sudden, now those 3 notes, that's like, well, it's a D major 7th chord, isn't it? Because there's the major 7th. And then after that D chord, then you hear your A chord with an added second in it. That's the B there. And then the next chord you hear is an F sharp minor chord. So now you've got an F sharp minor with, now that B is a 4th, an added 4th to the F sharp minor chord. Then you get an E chord next. And actually kind of a sus move. And you think, ooh, that's kind of a nasty clash against that. But that's that kind of angst, because you've heard this thing going, your brain just kind of accepts the fact that, okay, that's a constant. So even when you crash against it, so the point is, even though these 3 notes, now independently, these 3 notes, it's do, re, mi, it's Charlie Brown. Those 3 notes could be anything, but the way you identify them is keyed to the bass note that's underneath. Let's take our C major triad, for instance. And every bass note that you put underneath it, it's changing the function. So this chord actually turns into something different. Obviously with a C root, it's a C that you know. Now a B underneath it, you say, well, you can't really use that, can you? Well, the kind of place you hear that would be in a bass walk. In other words, if I'm, open the eyes of my heart, Lord, open the eyes of my heart, I want to see you. So you actually do hear that when it's part of a bass walk. Your brain kind of follows that walk and it accepts the fact that, well, it's a nasty crash there, but that's because it's walking down. So the melody in the bass kind of helps you buy that. This next altered chord is a classic. This is a unique animal called the sharp 9 chord. Let me show you how it works. If you think C major, now when you say 9, that implies that the 7th is in there. It's a dominant 7th. 9 is D, so sharp 9 is D sharp, right? Now, you look at that and you think, well, that D sharp is the same as E flat. So what you're telling me is you've got a major third and a minor third in the same chord, right? You would think that, you know, those two would just be such a crash that you wouldn't be able to tolerate it, but the truth of the matter is that this chord is like a staple in like funk music, in gospel and jazz. You hear it all the time. But the point is not to avoid that crash. The point is to like point out the crash. Think of it in you know, like every James Brown song, like I Feel Good. A great example of a sequence of them is in, you know, Steely Dan. There's the sharp 9 chord. Another one. So that's definitely a chord you're going to run across. The thing is, don't be thrown off by the fact that it has both the major third and the minor third. That crash is what makes that chord cool. That's the sharp 9 chord.